Welcome back, everybody, to our postprandial stupor on day 2 of the Bioconductor 2024 conference. Hopefully, Steve will be waking you up momentarily. Our next keynote speaker is Dr. Stephen Piccolo from Brigham Young University. And are you jointly at University of Utah now as well? No. Okay, Brigham Young exclusively. The glorious graduate program in bioinformatics at Brigham Young is enough to keep any human being busy. So Steve did his undergraduate degree at Brigham Young and then moved for his PhD to the University of Utah, working with Evan Johnson. Working briefly with Evan Johnson, and then full-time at the University of Utah and Boston University, where Dr. Johnson moved for your postdoc, and then back to BYU for a professorship, and now as associate professor at Brigham Young. Steve has kindly agreed to give our next keynote lecture. So this one is our mandatory how on earth are we going to deal with these LLMs that are trying to eat everything and still manage to provide a halfway decent education to biological informaticists.
Well, thanks, Tim, and thanks for the invite to be here. I'm really glad to be here speaking. I'm going to err on the side of breadth rather than depth today. Hopefully, I'll give everybody something that you can relate to and learn from, but I'm also happy to discuss with any of you in more depth any of the things that I talk about today. Okay. So the first topic I want to talk about is dataset finding. So if any of you have heard of the FAIR data principles, this is the first of those principles. And it's a challenge. If we can't find the data that we want to be able to analyze, there's not really much that we can do as far as the other FAIR data principles. Okay, so just a little background. Triple negative breast cancers are more aggressive and have higher mortality rates for people of African descent than for other groups. To some extent, we know that factors such as healthcare, income levels, and trust in physicians explain these differences, but there may be, at the biological level, there may be factors that explain these differences as well. So I have a student, a PhD student who's just finishing up. His name is Ife Nwosu, and he was really interested in understanding more about these differences. And so he collected a huge set of data from the public domain, curated them, annotated them with ontology terms, and made it easier for us and hopefully for other people to analyze the data. And one thing, this is a preprint. Hopefully we'll have that published soon. We're just putting some finishing touches on that, some tweaks to it. One thing that he found along the way, which probably isn't a surprise to any of you who have worked with publicly available data, is that relevant metadata are often not recorded. There's a big mix of some data sets are more comprehensive than others as far as the metadata that they provide and the way things are described. And also it was difficult to find relevant data sets. He had to do a lot of searching in Gene Expression Omnibus and Array Express and through Google searches and PubMed searches and all things like that to be able to try to find all these data sets that he found. And he wasn't able to find very many that had race metadata in them. Okay, it's just an example here. If I put in the Geo search engine, Gene Expression Omnibus search engine, if I put breast cancer in there, you can see there's a total of 230,000 series that you would be searching through. And if you just put in breast cancer, it would come up with almost 4,000 candidate series that may or may not be relevant to the questions that you have. I can do some additional filtering where I can use mesh terms, for example. So in this case, I'm putting in breast neoplasms. When I search for that, it does limit it down to 2,400 data sets. And I've also limited it based on microarrays. And I think I also had RNA-seq data sets in here, and you can limit it based on the species that you're searching for. But it's still a lot of data sets to be able to have to sift through in order to try to find the ones that you're most interested in for your specific questions. You're going to find some data sets that are irrelevant for what you're looking for, and it's probably going to miss some relevant ones that you would have hoped to find. Okay, and we can be more specific. We can try to put in things like if we wanted to search for triple negative breast cancer, we can search for that. I was searching, I may be missing something, but I wasn't able to use the mesh term for that. I'm not sure why, but when I put that in there, it didn't bring up the mesh term for triple negative breast cancer. So the solution that we've devised is to use a technique called semantic search. So the idea here is that a researcher would use an existing search engine, such as the one I was just showing you, find some data sets that are relevant to whatever questions that they're interested in. And then they would say, let's use a language model to go and look for, based on the descriptions of those data sets that you had found, let's use a language model to be able to identify other data sets that are out there in Geo that are described similarly. And for this project, I've worked with some really talented and hardworking undergraduates, James Wengler and Grace Sammons Brown, who've helped me do a lot of this work. They're now moved on to bigger and better things. Okay, so when we have these data set descriptions, let's say we have 8 data sets, we go and we pull out those descriptions, and then we would use a language model in order to convert those descriptions, English language descriptions, into numerical vectors or embeddings. Okay, so each row here on the right would be an embedding for one particular data set. And then what we want to do is say, if we have these 8 that kind of look like this, they're sort of described sort of similarly. Let's go and look in the rest of Geo and try to find other data sets that are similar. And we use a k nearest neighbor algorithm for doing that. Okay, and then we needed some way to, as we developed this method, we needed some way to be able to evaluate how well it was working. So we use GEMMA, which is an online resource of curated gene expression data. It has a lot of data for human diseases, especially neurological disorders and cancers. And they have annotations in there saying this particular data set is associated with medical condition X or Y or Z. So we were able to use that as a gold standard in our analysis. We focused on 6 different conditions, and you can see here the number of geoseries that were available in GEMMA for each of these, some of them just a relatively small number, and then others that had over 100 data sets that had been annotated as being associated with these different conditions. Okay, and we used a training and testing design, and we evaluated 30 different models that we got from, mostly from Hugging Face, which is an open access, ecosystem for language models. And some of these were really simple, just simple word counting. How many times do we see a particular word? And is that similar to in one data set versus another? All the way up to really complex models that have been trained on billions of documents. Okay, and this is a little bit small, and I apologize for that, but it's more of the big picture that I'm trying to show you here. So with these 30 different models, I guess let me say too on this, there are thousands of different models available in Hugging Face, and this it's changing every day where new ones are being added every day. So we just kind of wanted to get some idea for what the capabilities would be using a variety of different language models for this. Okay, and so on the left are the ones that performed the best. They had the lowest rank. And what we saw is that some performed much better than others. And we did see that, as you might expect, if you know anything about kind of the world of language models these days, that transformer-based architectures tended to perform really well, although sometimes transformer-based architectures did not perform so well. We tested some that had been trained using biomedical or biological data or corpuses, and others that were trained more broadly on general texts or scientific texts, but not necessarily biological or biomedical texts. So this one that performed the best was built by an organization in China. There's others that are like Roberta is a really well-known transformer architecture. But you can see that generally the ones trained on general corpuses tended to perform better than those that were trained on biological or scientifically oriented texts. That may be just the size of the source that they're being built from. There also wasn't much of a pattern as far as the embedding size. Sometimes some of the best ones didn't necessarily have the largest embedding sizes. Okay, we also did a comparison against a manual search of geo. So those are shown in blue there, whereas the top 3 performing language models that we tested are shown in red. You can see that for different medical conditions, the performance was different. It varied a fair amount. So for juvenile idiopathic arthritis, with our language models, we were able to identify pretty quickly almost all of the ones that were relevant. Whereas for some of the other conditions like neuroblastoma, there are cell lines that are from neuroblastoma patients. And so I think sometimes those there are lots of data sets that aren't necessarily about neuroblastoma that have the word neuroblastoma in them. So it was more difficult to be really precise in identifying data sets associated with that particular medical condition. Sometimes the manual searches returned a list of data sets that was relatively short. So as the blue lines go to the right, you can see some of them end after 50 or 20 data sets. And that's just because the geo searches often didn't return as large of a number of data sets. But generally, I think it's safe to say that this semantic search approach is promising. It suggests that we can use that technique maybe to improve our ability to find data sets that are relevant to a certain topic. Just some caveats. This was not an exhaustive benchmark comparison. We're not trying to claim that these particular models are better than any other ones that are out there, just to give us some sense for how these perform and how much variability there is and things like that. There are probably models that performed poorly here that would perform really well in other contexts. And I guess I didn't mention that includes OpenAI. Their models performed well, but not at the very top of our models. Okay. So conclusion for this part of the talk is that large language models have strong potential to aid with data set finding. And in ongoing work, we are developing a search tool that will also support zero-shot learning. So basically enabling researchers to type in a description and then hopefully find data sets that are relevant to that description. Okay, so we're going to shift now and talk about image accessibility. This project was worked on by 2 other undergrads, Harlan Stevens and Arwen Oakley, who also did great work and were key to making this project possible. Okay, so red-green color blindness, also known as deuteranopia, is a sex-linked trait. It affects about 8% of males and about 0.5% of females. And this is specific to people of European descent. We don't really have good data for other populations, at least that I was able to find. But it's a condition that affects quite a large number of people, probably including some people in this room. Some of you may have seen this little test. It's called the Ishihara test, where you may be able, it depends on the projector here, but you may be able to see in this figure a 2-digit number. And if you can, that means you're probably not red-green colorblind. If you can't decipher that, then it's possible that you are red-green colorblind. Okay, but little is known about the frequency with which figures in biology-related articles are accessible to deuteranopes, or people that have red-green color blindness. It's not as simple as just detecting particular shades of green and red. So I'm going to show you a few examples here. So here's a figure from an article in eLife, the journal. And so you can see that we have proliferation rates over time. And there are green lines and reddish lines, and there's some lines are solid, some lines are dashed. So if you're not red-green colorblind, you can probably decipher the meaning of this with help from the caption, which I'll show you here in a second. But if you do have deuteranopia, it might be a little challenging because when I look, so what I'm showing here is a simulated version. So if you don't have red-green color blindness, this helps you to kind of see what the same figure would look like to somebody who does have red-green color blindness. If we look at the caption, it says data from adherent cells is shown in green and data from floating cells in red. Experimental replicate 1 results are shown with solid lines and replicate 2 are shown with dashed lines. Okay, but at least for me, when I look at that, I'm not very well able to differentiate between what were the red and the green lines. It would be challenging to decipher the scientific meaning of that. You may be able to, but it would be more challenging. Okay, here's another example. This is a protein folding diagram. And if I show you the simulated version, here I'm just going to flip back and forth a little bit there. You can still probably get the general message. There are some colors that are washed out as you go from one to the other, but you probably can get the same general message from these two figures, depending on whether you're colorblind or not. Here's another example. So many of the ones that we found, I'll talk about this in a minute, that we found to be problematic are from fluorescence microscopy images like this one here, where we have different stains highlighting different aspects of the images. And in this case, you can see the nuclei on the right-hand side. The nuclei are in red, but if we go to the simulated version, though, it's very difficult to detect where those nuclei are. It would be harder to interpret the image if you have red-green color blindness. Okay, but again, the point is we can't just look for color, the presence of certain colors. We have to also look at whether we can interpret the scientific meaning of the figures by looking at them or not. Okay, so what we did is we manually reviewed 5,000 images from eLife, an open access journal that publishes a variety of different kinds of biology-related research. We examined whether images had potentially problematic color combinations, and also whether color contrast ratios, labels, and or spatial distances mitigated these potential problems. So even though you may have problematic colors, it may be totally doable for somebody to interpret those images depending on whether they've tried to alleviate those potential problems. Okay, and just at a high level, what we found was that about 13% of all of the figures that we evaluated, we concluded were definitely problematic for people who have deuteranopia. And this number is along the lines of other studies that have been done in other disciplines, suggesting this is really a significant problem for people in the field. Okay, the good news here is that according to our estimates, the problem is slowly declining. So the green bars on this graph are showing the percentage of friendly or okay images, and the purple bars are showing the number that are problematic. Okay, and for 2022, we only had data for images for about half of the year, so that's why the bars on that one are lower. Okay, so there is some reason to be optimistic that people are maybe becoming more aware of this challenge. We have better tools out there as well to help with this problem. So it is getting better, but there's still a problem to be concerned about. When we looked at disciplines and which ones had the most problematic images, it was cell biology related fields. So cell biology itself, developmental biology, stem cell biology, those fields tend to have the highest proportions of images that are problematic for people with red-green color blindness. I will point out, because the audience here is a lot of people here focus on genetic and genomic data, you can see there in the middle that there's a relatively small number of images in this field that are problematic. But if you're like me, you probably still see figures like this, red-green heat maps that are almost always problematic for somebody with deuteranopia. So definitely you want to think about the color schemes that you use when you make heat maps, but also other types of figures that you make. Okay, we evaluated the potential to semi-automate, so we don't think we're going to be able to completely automate this, but at least guide us in the right direction of detecting figures that are not accessible to deuteranopes. So we devised 5 different metrics based on the number of problematic color pairs, the proportion of pixels that use those problematic color pairs, the distances between the colors that could be problematic. We compared the simulated images that show you what it would look like for a deuteranope versus somebody who doesn't have red-green color blindness, and try to come up with simple metrics that we could use for detecting whether an image was problematic or not. We combine those all together using a logistic regression and classifier to make a prediction for individual images. We also developed a model that used a convolutional neural network. So rather than using these metrics, that actually the convolutional neural network takes as input an image or various images, we trained a model to be able to differentiate between problematic and non-problematic images, and evaluated how well we could identify problematic ones. Okay, we optimized our parameters using cross-validation on a training set, this training set that we had of 5,000 images. And then we also did some additional curation. We curated an additional 1,000 images selected from eLife. And then to get a more broad sampling, we selected images from the PubMed Central Open Access subset across a more broad range of journals and disciplines. Okay, and this is showing what we found. So the area under the receiver operating characteristic curve for logistic regression on the eLife images test set was 0.82, whereas on the convolutional neural network attained an AUROC of 0.89. So really it was quite effective at identifying problematic images. On the PubMed Central data set, though, the accuracy went down quite a bit, suggesting that it was harder when we had a more diverse set of images. Some limitations to this work are, number one, the image reviewers were not deuteranopes. Okay, so these are people who did not have red-green color blindness, therefore they could look at both the original image and the simulated image, and they can kind of compare the two and evaluate what the experience of a deuteranope might be. But not being deuteranopes, they weren't able to know for sure what that experience was. But we feel like that was a decent option for us to use, again, because they could see both versions of the image, not just how it would be experienced by one of those groups. When you simulate the images, there's a threshold, a severity threshold that you select. And so a threshold of 1 would mean complete deuteranopia, whereas I think it's 0.5 would be somebody who doesn't have red-green color blindness. We chose 0.8 to kind of err on the side of being more severe, but not complete deuteranopia. And this just, it's a limitation. We had to pick a threshold, but let's see. But yeah, we could have evaluated additional thresholds to see what kind of impact that would have. And this also reflects the fact that humans experience red-green color blindness at different levels. Another limitation is that manual curation, or another thing that we could do is have domain experts review these images. So where I might not be an expert at reading protein folding diagrams, somebody who is expert at that could more effectively tell me whether it would be interpretable for somebody depending on the color scheme that was used. Okay, conclusion of this part is we think that convolutional neural networks in particular show promise for semi-automating the process of identifying problematic scientific figures. A couple other things. One is that we built a web app where you can upload images. So if you just go to bioapps.byu.edu, you can upload a PNG or a JPG file. It'll show you a simulated version of that image. So you can, it'll also give you a prediction from our CNN model as to whether it's friendly or not. But you as a human can also evaluate that and see how does it look in the original form versus how does it look in the simulated form. I think this could be a really valuable thing for any scientist to do before they submit a paper, is just check and make sure if you have images that have color in them, are they going to be accessible given the color scheme that you're using. And just some general recommendations on this topic. So one is just be aware of accessibility needs. This is one type of accessibility that we might not always think about, but it's important to be aware of it. One trick that you can do is first make your images in grayscale and then make sure that the message comes through in grayscale. And then if you think that adding color would improve the message or make it even better, you could add that. Just make sure first that it's understandable in grayscale. When you do use color, there are colorblind friendly palettes in R and other languages that you can use that can make it easier to avoid those problematic color combinations. If you do any kind of fluorescence microscopy experiments, one thing you can do is just avoid those red and green dyes to make those images as broadly accessible as possible. I feel like I should ask for questions now, but I guess I'll wait till the end. Okay, the third part is about bioinformatics education. Okay, so at BYU, I teach a course called Introduction to Bioinformatics. And in that course, we teach basic command line skills, Python programming skills, mostly to biology students who are from biology-related majors who mostly have never programmed before. So we give them exercises like this. So this is a simplified version, but suppose that you work for the Forest Service and your job is to monitor wildlife. Write a Python function that, given lists of animals and their weights, returns the name of the individual with the lowest weight. Okay, so a fairly simple programming task. One that's a little more complex, write a Python function that identifies simple sequence repeats in a given DNA sequence, and we specifically want them to use a regular expression to identify all series of A2 nucleotides that repeat 3 or 4 times and are preceded and followed by a G or a C nucleotide. And then we also have them learn how to use existing packages like pandas and seaborn. In this case, we're asking them to create a box plot based on the data. Okay, so I give these exercises to my students, and at the end of 2022, as most of you know, ChatGPT came into the world as we know it, and I found out that it could write code, and so I said, let me try ChatGPT on some of these programming exercises that I give to my students and see how well it can solve them. And I was impressed by its ability to solve these basic programming problems. It just so happened that at that time I had the opportunity of going on sabbatical to Auckland, New Zealand, where I interacted with Paul and Andrew, who are experts in the intersection of artificial intelligence and education. And so we decided to do a formal study where I took all 184 of these programming problems that I give in Python to my students. We put them into ChatGPT and evaluated how well it could solve each of those problems that I give to my students. And the short answer is it solved all of them but 5. I did have to use multiple attempts or interact with the model multiple times for some of them, but the large majority it solved on the first attempt. And these were exercises that I didn't have out on GitHub, probably hadn't been fed into the model previously, but the model was really good at solving those kinds of problems. So I had to think about, what does this mean from a teaching perspective, but also what does it mean for researchers who are learning to code in Python or learning how to do bioinformatics related tasks? Could this be a tool that could help people in that context or lower the barrier for people who are learning how to code? And I think the short answer is yes, but of course there are always going to be caveats and limitations. We published a paper in PLOS Computational Biology that has all the details. I'd love for you to go and read it in more detail. Another little project we worked on while I was there, and I'm just going to touch on this one briefly, is we wanted to see how well can ChatGPT convert existing programming exercises, educational exercises, into other programming languages. So let's say that you first learned Python or R, but maybe you wanted to take those skills and apply them or learn a new programming language so that you could apply your skills in a different way. For example, the Rust programming language is one that's very much loved by developers and is very fast and has a lot of benefits over, say, a language like C++. If you wanted to learn a language like that, instead of having to recreate all of these programming exercises as an instructor, could I use a model like GPT to be able to translate those and make my teaching experience more efficient and provide more resources for my students? So we input all of these into the model, and it did really well. You can see here the lines in red. What that means? Well, I guess what I'm showing here is that when I just fed in the English language prompt into ChatGPT, it often was able to translate those effectively, but it often did better when I gave it the Python code itself, or if I gave both the prompt and the code to the model, it was able to do better most of the time. But all of the time when I gave, or sometimes it was able to solve it with one or the other, but in a large percentage of cases, it solved using at least one of those inputs. You can see that Julia is a little bit behind the other languages as far as ChatGPT's ability to translate those problems, but overall it does a really good job. Harlan Stevens, I mentioned him earlier, one of my undergrads. For the ones that the model was not able to translate perfectly, he went through by hand and tweaked the solutions that had been generated by the model and made it so that all of these, so that we now have fully functioning solutions for all of these different languages. So if anybody is interested in learning or practicing your skills in Rust or C++ or JavaScript or Julia, we have these publicly available where you can go and you can try your hand at these different exercises. And so if you want to try that, I'd love to give you access to that. And again, that would be free. Okay. The main question I want to focus on is this last one. So we asked, how well can an LLM act as a virtual assistant to novice programmers? So one challenge that we face as instructors is that we have TAs that we hire, and these students, when they get stuck on their problems, they'll go and meet with a TA, but it's always hard to make sure we have enough TAs, and sometimes students, they might need help at midnight, or there might be a line out the door. So we wanted a way that we could hopefully help these students and not have to rely quite as much on human teaching assistants to get help with their coding. Okay, so we did an experiment both in the Bio 165 Introduction to Bioinformatics Python course that I mentioned earlier, but also this course that I teach called Statistical Analysis for Biologists, where we teach R programming and then also basic statistical skills. We did an experiment where we gave them access to what we call a virtual assistant within this auto grader that we've created called CodeBuddy. So we use this tool to deliver our programming assignments. And within that, this is an open source tool that I'd also love for people to try out if they're interested. But within that web interface, there is a little box that will come up like this that says, hello, I'm your virtual assistant. Do your best to solve this exercise on your own. But if you get stuck, you can enter a question below. And behind the scenes, it connects into ChatGPT's API, ChatGPT-4. And we specifically give the model instructions not to give the answer to students. The goal here is hopefully that instead of going directly to ChatGPT, putting in the problem and then asking it to generate a solution for them, but maybe they don't really have to think through how to solve that problem very well. They get the homework done, but maybe then when they do an exam, they might not have really, or hopefully if they use this interface, they would learn more than if they just went and got the answer and copied and pasted it. Okay, so we put constraints on it, asking the model to only give like one tip at a time on how to overcome the problem they're facing. Okay, so just a couple of examples. If I were to say, can you give me the answer? This is just one time where it said, as an assistant, I cannot provide the answer directly, but I can guide you. And then it gives some advice. This is for an R programming related problem. Or another example, we asked, my output has too many lines. So we're checking the output to see if it matches the expected output. How can I fix that? So then it goes and gives some advice on how to solve that problem. Okay, I'm just going to give you a bunch of data kind of on what we found in this experiment. We finished this, we did the experiment at, let's see, it was January and February of 2024. One thing we found is that students used this virtual assistant at pretty much all hours of the day that you might think a college student would be awake, at least at BYU. Maybe they're not up as late as at some other places. But other than maybe between the hours of 2 and 6 a.m., students were using this virtual assistant throughout the day. Again, suggesting that instead of having to go to a human TA who might be on the other side of campus, they could go to this virtual assistant for help. The total interactions per exercise varied a fair amount. So the ones on the right, those are maybe some of our harder programming problems. And so students were asking more questions of the virtual assistant for some of those, whereas some of the ones on the left side were some of our easier problems that they weren't needing as much help for. There's also a lot of variation on, per student, how much they interacted with the virtual assistant. We had a few students that were using it all the time. So hopefully that means they found it useful. Whereas other students, there were some who did have access to it, but chose not to use it for whatever reason. We looked at a lot of factors to see, does this correlate with how much students are using this resource? And really the only factor that we found that was correlated with it significantly was the number of credits, or how far along in their education these students were. So it was interesting that students who were earlier on in their educational experience were using it more. And that could be because maybe they just had less experience, maybe they hadn't been exposed to programming as often as some of the students who were later on in the program, but it's hard to know for sure what the reasons behind that were. Okay, and I'm mentioning this now just to kind of give some context, but what we did here was for both of these classes, we had 2 units at the beginning of the semester, and we used a counterbalance design. So with one, for the first unit, about half of the students were randomly assigned so that they did have access to the virtual assistant, whereas the other half of the class did not have access to it. And then during the second unit, we swapped it around so we could see, so that the other group who didn't have it before would have it. And we specifically asked them, if you do have access to this virtual assistant, please don't let your buddy use it alongside with you, because we're kind of doing a study here and we want to keep things independent as much as we could. Basically, what we found was that there were no differences. So these numbers that you see on the right, these are all p-values. You can see that there were no differences in the number of homework problems that students submitted, the number of homework problems that they completed, or their exam scores between those 2 groups. And at first, I was really disappointed that I didn't see a significant difference. But on the other hand, when I thought about it, I thought maybe that's actually not such a bad thing, because it's showing that whether students are using a virtual TA or getting help from other resources, including a human TA, that hopefully means that they're getting the help they need, and that they're at least not having bad outcomes as a result of using this. We can't say that for sure, but that's sort of what the data suggests could be happening. When we surveyed the students and asked them for their subjective feedback on using the model, this is sort of a high level of what we saw. Most students said it was at least somewhat helpful. There were a few who said it was not helpful. And then some had access to it, but they chose not to use it for whatever reason. Just to give you a little glimpse into what some of these comments were, one student who said it was extremely unhelpful said it could tell them, it could only help them really if there was just one simple line of code that had a problem. Somebody who said it was somewhat unhelpful said it's most helpful when giving formatting advice, not so much helping you generate hints on the functions you should be using to achieve a desired outcome. So if they had existing code that was kind of working, it might help for that, but not saying, oh, you should be using this other tool that you're not using. An example of somebody who found it somewhat helpful said the virtual assistant was helpful when it helped me recognize that I was using a specific function incorrectly. It helped me correct lots of different parts of my code so I could get the right outcome. It took figuring out how to ask it the right questions to get it to work. And I think all of us have probably experienced that with LLMs. And then they said, sometimes it would suggest a technique for solving a problem that we hadn't learned in class yet. That's a really important point. It's a big challenge with using LLMs in an educational setting, is that if you haven't covered a certain technique and a large language model says, hey, you should think about using this technique, that could be a good thing, but it could also just confuse them and cause problems. And so I'm not sure yet how to overcome that challenge. Somebody who said it was extremely helpful said, when I had an error pop up that I didn't understand, or when I was stuck on how to do one part of the problem, it was helpful then. It was especially nice when I had an idea in my mind of what I wanted to do, but I didn't know exactly what code I needed in order to be able to do it. Okay, so in summary, some limitations. There was no viable way that we could restrict students from using ChatGPT directly. So that's a confounding effect. We only allowed them up to 3 interactions per exercise. Part of that was to save costs on the back end. And then Another limitation is that other LLMs may perform better than ChatGPT. We just tested this one model, and other LLMs that may be useful might not be proprietary like OpenAI's models are. But in conclusion, we think that at least using this teaching assistant probably did not harm students and may have helped them, and it could be a useful supplement to human teaching assistants and other resources. Okay. Again, I'm grateful for the chance to be here, and love to hear any questions that you have.
Hi, great talk on a lot of interesting topics. My first question is on the colorblind part of the talk. Have you experimented at all with like AI recoloring of images to make them colorblind friendly?
Yeah, so I haven't experimented with that. That is definitely an area, or there are tools out there for doing that, where you can say, let's take this image that is not suitable for somebody who has color blindness, and let's try to tweak it so that it is. So that's one technique that you can use. But I would say a better option, I guess that's useful for images that are already out there. But if you're creating new images, then it's best if you just start with like colorblind friendly palettes and things like that.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you so for the nice talk. I'm really interested about the educational part, which is the part 3. So I guess I'm curious about your philosophy of teaching for the new generation of scientists about coding, statistical coding. Like, do you believe in helping them to actually learn how to code, or do you believe in the future should be teaching them how to write prompts to ask ChatGPT to code for them?
Yeah, it's a really important question. I still strongly believe we should be teaching them how to code. I think that LLMs can be a valuable aid that, you could think of them sort of sitting alongside a student as they learn and helping them when they get stuck. But I think that we're probably a long way. It's hard to say. I mean, 3 years ago, I wouldn't have thought that we would be where we are today, but I think we're still probably a fair distance away from being able to have LLMs that just code for us and make us obsolete as programmers. I think you still need to know how to code, what the code is doing behind the scenes. And then also, like I said, there are cases where a large language model will give me advice that I don't really understand, or I need to kind of consider the context of that advice that's given to me. Just like with a Google search, I need to be able to, when I do a Google search, go and evaluate the advice that's given to me from different websites and things like that. It's the same thing. I need to be able to do that with advice that's given from a large language model.
I just want to make a really short comment. I really enjoy the emphasis you put, the why its advice may or may not work. I think that is it's a word for life too.
Say that one more time. I don't think.
In life in general, otherwise may work or may not work.
Yeah, thank you.
So I noticed a common thread, or what I perceived as a common thread across all 3 of the segments of your talk, which was that it would have been ideal to have domain experts or people who are actually deuteranopes, or who, you mentioned a hard cutoff of 0.8. I have no idea whether somebody considers themselves colorblind at any given cutoff, or just based on whether they have difficulty reading papers in their field, whether that's field specific. But all of that and the student remarks all sort of spoke to me in terms of, would it be possible to recalibrate some of these models using either direct preference optimization or reinforcement learning with human feedback? Is that a viable way to evolve these forward?
Yeah. So on the first comment, I think there's still, our hope is that this colorblindness research opens up future directions for research where maybe it's more qualitative in nature, where we sit down with people who do have deuteranopia and kind of understand more about their experience with specific images. And, ideally people who are domain experts could be part of that as well, to get a better sense of things. This is more to kind of start going in the direction of making these images more accessible. As far as the fine-tuning models based on student feedback or tailoring them to specific educational contexts, I think there's a huge opportunity and a need there. And I think that's really how we're going to get closer to making these really useful in the real world.
Hello, very interesting talk. As a person who's very enthusiastic about education and bioinformatics, this is very interesting research. I'm curious, as an educator, do you think it would benefit the students if you gave them quizzes and questions, some challenges that is almost impossible to do with large language models? The challenge mainly was that large language models in most generic contexts can provide a pretty decent code for doing very basic things. But when you start to get into some of the more advanced math that has not been well sophisticatedly developed, then it starts to, it's not trained well on the most recent ideas on how to do. So there's been some studies, there's been some ideas, hey, maybe we should just make the questions more harder. Maybe this would really challenge them to learn further. What are your opinions?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I think, number one, I think it's going to be a game of cat and mouse where eventually the large language models are going to get smarter and better able to handle those kinds of problems that you're presenting to students in hopes that it won't be doable by the model. The other answer is, oh, no, I just lost it. Students can get really frustrated if you give them really, really hard problems. Not that we shouldn't give hard problems to students, right, but if you jump up the level of difficulty too quickly, it can be really discouraging to them, and they might think, oh, I'm just not good at this, and then kind of give up on it. What we do I don't know how common this is at other universities, but when we give exams in a setting that's secure so that they don't have access to the internet. They're not able to use ChatGPT or other techniques. We don't give them access to the virtual assistant. So it's mostly, we just have to encourage them and say, yes, when you're doing your homework, you can go and you can ask ChatGPT to solve this problem for you. You could, just like you could go to a human TA and go and ask them for help with a problem. But we just kind of use caution to sit, or we express caution and say, don't rely too much on other people or technologies as you're doing the homework, because when you're in an exam, you're not going to be able to have those resources. So you want to make sure that you can be as independent as possible when you learn these skills.
I see. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we got a couple of online questions. First is from Tyrone Lee. And he said, I wonder what the cost was for hosting the LLM for the course. 90 plus interactions could be very pricey for certain students.
Yeah, so I should have mentioned that actually after I published that first paper, OpenAI reached out to me and they gave me and my colleagues some research credits that we used. So thankfully for us, it didn't cost us any money. But also the cost of the API, interacting with the API is really, it's going down, and it's actually really quite reasonable. So I would guess if we were paying for it, it would be maybe less than $100 or $200. It really wasn't too much. And we're paying students like $13 an hour to be a human TA. We still need to hire those students, but if we can get the model to do some of the low-hanging fruit for us, that may be a way to save some money.
All right, and then the second question was from Seiyun O. Should the first part, you said you embed data sets. What did you use for the embedding, which is to say, what was the input for the transformers, the whole article? Okay,
yeah. So for the data set finding part of the paper, we used the title, the title in Geo, the description of the data set in Geo, and the overall design description in Geo. So if there was an article associated with it, we didn't use that as input. That's something that we are looking to do in the future.
So to my best understanding, the goal of education in computer science or statistics is to produce people who are able to solve problems related to those fields. Towards evidence-based practice, have you tried stacking up someone who's proficient in coding to someone who's proficient in prompting a GPT-like model or a large language model or any other AI source and seeing who performs better?
Are you asking if we did do that, or if we?
Have you done it, or are you considering
Oh.
doing that?
We haven't done it. I think it would be an interesting thing to do. I think that, I guess in answer to one of the previous questions, I do think it would be valuable to provide some insight to students on how do you effectively create a prompt to get the help that you need. But yeah, I guess the answer is no, I haven't done that. But I mean, I'm a fairly expert programmer. I've been coding for 25 years, and I still use ChatGPT pretty much every day, just because it makes my work more efficient. So I think probably the place where most people want to be is somewhere in the middle, not somebody who, hey, I never need to rely on ChatGPT. You're probably going to be less efficient if you feel that way, but we also don't want people who are only relying on that, who don't really know how to do things. They're relying too much on an LLM.
Cool, thanks.
Kind of follow up on the previous question. So when it comes to the educational setting, so like if you don't want students to use ChatGPT too much, then like what if you give them like more open-ended like projects as assignments? So like the students will have to be very creative, and because it's open-ended, there's no like hard like right or wrong answers. For like before I have TA the class for my advisor on computation biology, and we had a final project where we do analysis on this, but it's open-ended.
Yeah, I think that's a valuable thing to do. In my setting, I have fairly large numbers of students, and so the trade-off the calculation I have going in my head is how much time is that going to take, and can I be objective in my evaluations? But I think, those kinds of things are really valuable ways, or even just like live exams where you say, okay, here's the code that you created to solve this problem. Explain to me what it's doing and why you solved what you did. And I think just even something simple like that could be a valuable thing to do to evaluate how much students have actually learned.
Right, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
If people come up with further questions, you can either send them directly to Steve, or we've got both Slack and the chat online. So thanks again for what was clearly landed as a very rousing talk.
Thank you.